Okay, finally, under the Sixth Amendment, you're supposed to have the assistance of counsel, basically a defense lawyer, supposed to be provided for you, especially if you can't afford it. Now, originally, this only was supposed to be for federal cases, but it was later extended to state cases under Gideon
Welcome
versus
to the
Wainwright
Government and
in the
Economics
1960s.
Civil Rights and Civil Liberties lecture. Over the course of this lecture, there are three essential questions that you should be able to answer. The first essential question is, how does the Bill of Rights limit the government in the United States? The second, is the concept of due process important to a free society? And third, should the government have to inform each individual who is arrested of his or her rights? Over the course of the year, we've talked about the competing interest in our government. One of these push and pull situations deals with civil liberties versus civil rights, and oftentimes it's decided in the Supreme Court. Now, civil liberties are protection from the government. Remember, the Founding Fathers had a real concern about a very strong federal government. It was the basis for why we actually revolted against the British. Now, unlike civil liberties, civil rights actually wants the government to get involved. They want the government to step in and protect your freedom. What you end up with is this balancing act between civil liberties and civil rights. If you make civil liberties the important part of your government, you end up with a government that's so weak that it actually cannot protect your civil rights. But if you make civil rights the most important part, you end up with a government that's so strong that it takes away many of your freedoms. There are three things I want you to get out of the relationship between civil rights and civil liberties. It would be these. First, all your civil liberties are based on the ideas of individual rights and limited government. Second, all U.S. citizens benefit from civil liberties and rights guaranteed in the Constitution, but these rights are relative and not absolute. Remember, these rights can be taken away anytime that it's necessary for the best benefit of all people. Finally, you have the right to do as you please as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of others. So at this time, I want you to just think about it. What are some things that you can do, but yet there's still limits? Okay, take about 5 or 10 minutes and let's discuss a few of those. Okay, now that you've had a few moments to just discuss that balancing act between civil liberties and civil rights, I want you to think about when do your freedoms end in order to protect another person's rights or their own freedoms? One of those freedoms that we often talk about is the pursuit of happiness. Now let's just say that my pursuit of happiness is basically punching people. That is something that makes me happy. Well, how can the government actually stop me? Well, according to the laws, my right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins. Essentially, we've got laws that protect us from these abuses of our freedoms. Okay, another good example of this is using the word fire in a theater. Now, although I do have the right of freedom of speech, I don't have the right to use it in a situation that could cause bodily harm to a larger group. At the 1787 Constitutional Convention, the Founding Fathers argued vehemently over whether the new Constitution needed provisions that specifically protected individual rights.
On one hand, the Anti-Federalists wanted a list of individual liberties, a Bill of Rights to restrain the authority of the new national government. On the other hand, the Federalists argued that a national government could enhance rather than inhibit individual liberties. The Federalists were also afraid that if the framers tried to list individual liberties in the Constitution, anything that wasn't listed would not be protected, that listing individual rights might actually lead to more limitations on personal freedom. In the end, the Anti-Federalist argument wins out, and your very first 10 amendments make up what we call the Bill of Rights. Now, as you notice up here on the chart, I have the question, why were they actually established? Well, if you take a look at the very first amendment of the Bill of Rights, it begins with Congress shall make no law. Now, what this means is it originally applies to the federal limitations on individual rights. So let me give you an example of one that's kind of a time-honored tradition, the idea of freedom of religion. Now, what it meant was the federal government could not create a religion for the entire nation. It did not mean that a state could not create a state religion. So let me give you a couple examples. Now, one example is in Pennsylvania, where you had a group that was starting to become a minority, Quakers. There was such a huge fear that other religions would take over that they literally put in their constitution that Quakerism is an allowed state religion in Pennsylvania. In Massachusetts, the actual founding of that colony originally was with Puritan settlers, and they didn't have a real high toleration of other religions. Now, for that reason, they actually made it state law, going right up to the 19th century, that you had to be a part of the Congregational Church just to vote. So what changes all this? Well, it's the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. The 14th Amendment granted equal protection under the laws to all citizens. Now eventually, starting in the late 19th century going right through the 20th, the Supreme Court extends the protections of the Bill of Rights to be applied not only to federal actions but also to state actions as well. One of the most important parts of the 14th Amendment is actually the due process of law. Now what this actually means is a person cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. This means the government must act fairly and reasonably in accordance to established rules. So to give an example here at school, administrators have to basically give you the opportunity to plead your case. That's them acting fairly and reasonably and giving you due process. Out of the first 10 amendments, there is no other part of the Constitution that reflects the changes we have seen in American government, society, and culture than the First Amendment. As times have changed, our standards have changed for the way we look at many aspects of society, including what is obscene, what is offensive, and what is dangerous, and also what is a threat to national security. Largely because of its tension between individual rights and the protection of society, the First Amendment remains controversial and is often a battleground for arguments over what is right and what is wrong, and also what is good and what is bad in our culture. Now what we're going to do is we're going to break down the First Amendment into essentially 5 essential freedoms and rights that you should write down and actually understand for the test. The first of these 5 freedoms is the freedom of speech. It says in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of speech. Essentially, is it allow you to have the protection to express your views even if they're seen as unpopular. Now to give you an idea of just how far and how extreme this can go, there's a church known as the Westboro Baptist Church that has been going about the country protesting at the funerals of dead soldiers. Now what they bring are these signs and placards that say that because America supports gay policies or gay marriage and those sort of things, that our soldiers are actually being killed as an act of God. Now, one family of one of these soldiers actually sues the Westboro Baptist Church, saying that it was offensive and, just not a right thing to do at a funeral. In March of 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court actually hears this case in Snyder v. Phelps. And what they do is they come to an 8-1 decision in favor of Phelps. Now Phelps is represented by the Westboro Baptist Church. Now, what the majority opinion of the Supreme Court actually states is that the Westboro Baptist Church has special protection under the First Amendment, and that protection cannot be overcome by a jury finding that the picketers themselves are outrageous. Essentially, the First Amendment protects unpopular views. Now I'm going to show you a quick clip of the West Wing. What it's going to show is a flag being burned in protest. I want you to think for a moment whether or not this is allowable under the First Amendment.
We can't tell you what an honor it's been to be here, to actually work here in the White House. I want to thank our new best friend, Zoe Bartlett, the first daughter.
I'm not the first daughter.
What? I thought... Okay, Zoe Bartlett, the third daughter of the first family.
Come on, guys, one more trick.
You are just spoiled rotten.
Just one.
Please?
Please.
Well, you certainly deserve another trick. Tell her. A simple red handkerchief? So simple. There is nothing like a vanish, so pure. But what does it mean? I know what you're thinking. A magic trick, a simple vanish, can have no meaning whatsoever. What if instead of using a handkerchief, a meaningless piece of cloth, we were to use a piece of cloth that was nothing but meaning? What if the piece of cloth we chose was the flag of the United States of America? Because, you know, with this flag on stage, there's a lot to think about. Now, it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam. In full glory reflected, it shines in the stream. 'Tis a star-spangled banner. Oh, long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And what if instead of using that meaningless piece of construction paper, we were to use a piece of paper that means more to us than any other piece of paper in the world? The Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution, including my favorite amendment, the First Amendment. It's the one that guarantees not just everybody in this room, but every single person in the United States, every citizen, every visitor, every magician, freedom of speech. It's the one that says if we want to add a little bit of spontaneous combustion to our simple vanish, we can do that. We can take some tinder and a very eccentric magic wand, and we can do this. And it's okay. Because even though the flag is gone, the Bill of Rights remains.
They just burned an American flag in the White House. Where is Vinnick's office?
Dirksen 464.
Thanks.
Cut Penn and Teller's statement.
Let's see.
You're not gonna love it. So how about a few minutes after you get back from the Vinnick meeting?
For what?
For me, for that talk we were gonna have about...
Supreme Court has ruled that we can do whatever we want with the flag, and the Founding Fathers obviously intended. Are they still here?
Juggling identical objects, identical weights is pretty easy with about, 5 years practice. But juggling different weights, different shapes, stuff you just picked off people's desks, stuff you couldn't possibly have practiced with, that's when it gets a little bit tricky.
That's amazing.
Thanks a lot.
This statement does me absolutely no good. I need you guys to give me a statement saying exactly what you did last night, preferably that you did not burn a flag. And if you did actually burn a flag, I need you to admit it and emphasize that you did not clear your act with anyone in the White House.
So the question I have is Penn and Teller okay with burning the flag in the White House? According to Texas versus Johnson in 1989, a case where you actually have flags being burned in protest, the Supreme Court actually stated that it is okay to burn flags essentially as a form of freedom of speech. That makes Texas versus Johnson a precedent-setting case for other cases of freedom of speech, like the Westboro Baptist Church. The next freedom granted under the First Amendment is the freedom of religion. It states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or also prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, in order to interpret freedom of religion, there are two separate clauses that help us better define what this means. The very first one is the Establishment Clause. Now this sets up a wall or separation between church and state. Now here at school, that's one of the reasons why I can't lead a public prayer. With me being the teacher, I essentially represent the state or the government. Now with you being students, you guys are actually compelled to be here. Now if I'm actually leading a prayer in school, I am technically breaking the Establishment Clause. Now does that necessarily mean that no prayer is allowed here on school grounds? And basically the simple answer to this is no. Prayer is allowed here on school grounds. It just depends on who's doing it. Now that leads us to our next clause. Now the Free Exercise Clause essentially means that the government cannot prevent you from practicing your religion. So meaning that if you're here at school and you wish to pray, you're allowed to do so because you're a student. And if I was to tell you you're not allowed to, essentially I would be breaking your freedom of religion. Now the case that pretty much clearly defines this is Lemon v. Kurtzman in 1971. This is the precedent-setting case when justices try to figure out whether freedom of religion is being basically violated. The next freedom that's protected under the First Amendment is the freedom of the press. Basically, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. Now, freedom of expression has to be within reason, meaning that you can't libel or slander someone, essentially say things that are false and trying to pass it off as factual in order to destroy this person's reputation. And the next freedom is the freedom of assembly. Essentially, Congress shall make no law abridging the people to peaceably assemble. What this means is that you can have non-violent types of protest. Now this does not give demonstrators the right to trespass on private property. Now a good example of a protest movement that had violated some private property was the Occupy Wall Street movement. And what they had done is they had occupied a private park, Zuccotti Park. Now because Zuccotti Park was a private park, the city of New York had every right to remove the Occupy Wall Street protesters because they were trespassing. It really wasn't an issue of freedom of assembly. It was really an issue of trespassing on private property. The final freedom that's guaranteed under the First Amendment is the right to petition the government. Essentially, people can petition their government to try to change or try to make things better in their lives, essentially redress a grievance or a problem. And next up is the Second Amendment. And in the Second Amendment it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. Now if you look at this, it really was not intended for individuals to have the right to bear arms. Instead it was intended for the states to be able to have militias. Now the purpose of this was to protect themselves from a strong presence of the federal government. If you look back in American history, you can see where this has its origin. In the American Revolution, the British, in the very first battle, they were actually sent out to gather up the guns away from the Massachusetts militia. This being said, they understood that weapons protected their freedoms. So it's not until recently that people have looked at this Second Amendment as being an individual right to bear arms. And really, if you look at it historically, you don't have to wait until you get to DC versus Heller to where you have a court case that actually affirms the right for people to own arms. The Third Amendment says that no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without essentially the owner allowing it to happen. Now this has its roots in the American Revolution and it has only been challenged once or twice to the Supreme Court. Amendments 4, 5, and 6 all have to do with the due process of the law versus the actual use of police powers to keep you safe. Now the Fourth Amendment essentially deals with things like warrants, for example, and you're not allowed to actually search someone or search someone's home unless you have probable cause, meaning you have to have an actual reason. Now the precedent-setting case for the Fourth Amendment is Mapp v. Ohio in 1961. Essentially, police officers came to Mapp's house looking for somebody who had committed a burglary. Instead, they found things that were illegal in Mapp's home, and they decided to arrest Mapp for it. Now, the Supreme Court finds in favor of Mapp because the police officers were not there because Mapp had committed a crime. They were there looking for somebody else, meaning they had no probable cause or reason to actually search Mapp's home for these items. Now, the Fifth Amendment has all sorts of things going on, and usually when people think about the Fifth Amendment, they're thinking about watching like a television show and seeing mob bosses getting up there and saying, "I plead the Fifth." There's a reason for that. When you see someone pleading the Fifth in a movie, what they're doing is it's the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination, meaning that you can't be forced to give testimony that could be used against you. Another very important part of the Fifth Amendment is this concept of double jeopardy. Essentially, it's trying to keep the government from harassing people. So whether you're found guilty or not of a crime, you can't actually be tried for that same crime twice. The next thing the Fifth Amendment does is this idea of having due process of law, which could be kind of tricky, but it does have a real simple meaning. Now, we just merely need to know that due process means that laws have to be fair, and that if they're a fair law, they have to also be enforced fairly, meaning that if I stole an apple and you stole an apple, I don't get a $10 fine and then you get the death penalty. Now, some of the cases that the Supreme Court might see that have to deal with the Fifth Amendment when it comes to due process are things like the death penalty cases, affirmative action, privacy, and also voting rights. The final must-know thing for the Fifth Amendment actually deals with eminent domain, and we've already talked about this in class. But essentially, the government can take your property if it's in the best interest of the people for public use. But they do have to give you just compensation or fair compensation. Now, fair market value, or that just compensation, can be kind of tricky. If you've lived in a home for over 30 years and you were asked to move, it may be worth more to you emotionally than the actual money that you would receive in a real estate sale. No doubt the most far-reaching aspect of the Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination, even more than taking the Fifth, is the right to remain silent and the requirement that police inform a suspect of the right at the time of arrest. Now, we're talking, of course, of what's known as the Miranda warning. Now, the Miranda warning actually springs from a court decision, Miranda versus Arizona, in which Ernesto Miranda was essentially never told his rights and was, in a way, forced to give a statement admitting guilt. He was convicted, and then he ended up appealing it all the way to the Supreme Court. Okay, just like the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment is also full of different things that you need to know that are extremely important in protecting your rights. In all criminal prosecutions, you are supposed to be given a speedy and also a public trial. It's not supposed to be behind locked doors with no one knowing what's going on. And also the jury itself is supposed to be impartial, meaning that they're not just chosen out of the crowd to go against you. Now, the impartial or neutral jury is becoming harder and harder, especially in these cases that are being sensationalized in the news. With the 24-hour news cycle, it's hard to find an impartial jury. People usually walk in those doors already having an opinion on the case before actually hearing the evidence. You're also supposed to be told why you're actually being accused, and you're also supposed to be able to confront any witnesses who come out against you. So witnesses can't be anonymous. They just can't give information and then run away and hide. They are supposed to actually confront you in the court. Now, what it means to have this compulsory process to obtain witnesses in your favor is that you don't have to just have witnesses that are against you. You are allowed to call witnesses forth that can actually defend you or defend your character. It allows both sides to be heard. Now, the Seventh Amendment is basically talking about civil cases. Essentially, if you were accused in a civil case and the compensation is going to exceed the amount of $20, you have the right as the accused to ask for a trial by jury. Now, this applies to federal cases only, not state cases. And it's an important distinction because even though the 14th Amendment exists, there hasn't really been any precedent-setting cases that have basically forced all states to do exactly this. The Eighth Amendment is usually recognized as the cruel and unusual punishment amendment. Essentially, punishment should not be too cruel or too unusual, depending on the time. Now, this changes over time as our society changes as well. Now, when they're talking about excessive bail, what they're talking about is that, if both of us are going to be put on trial for theft, one of us shouldn't have to pay more than the other for bail. Essentially, the bail should be equitable between the two of us. The Ninth Amendment really talks about all those things that are not actually put into the Constitution. And those rights that are not put in the Constitution are supposed to be retained to the people. So a good example of that would be the right for privacy. Now, the right to privacy is not specifically mentioned anywhere in the Constitution, but few people would say there's no such thing. We all have the right to be left alone, especially from the government interference in our personal lives. Now, the 10th Amendment is kind of similar to the 9th Amendment, essentially saying that all the powers that are listed in the Constitution are essentially the powers of the federal government, and anything that's not mentioned is really still reserved for the states. Now, what this is, it's the essence of federalism.